This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 279th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. Many of you have been asking me to put together a handy-dandy landing page that organizes all the posts on some of my most popular subjects. Took me a while, but they are now up. If you visit my homepage at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com and look at the top of the left sidebar, you'll see links to my series on character arcs, my series on story structure, and my series on scene structure. I hope you'll find these all-in-one mini courses a helpful resource to keep at your fingertips. I wish I'd done it years ago. I've already found the accessibility super useful for myself. The latest post in the video series on my blog is, are you leaving this crucial ingredient out of your book's first chapter? It shows how you can take a page from Captain America: The Winter Soldier to hook readers with even a small amount of character development in your book's first chapter. To find the post, visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now, I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled Most Common Writing Mistakes, Part 38, Irrelevant Endings. Is there anything more fun, more bittersweet, or more challenging than book endings? Arguably nothing matters more for ensuring reader satisfaction than the ending of a book. As such, few parts of your story are going to be more important to get right. But naturally, the room for error rises in direct proportion to the importance of any aspect of your novel. One of the easiest writing mistakes to fall into in your book endings is actually one that has as much to do with book beginnings, and indeed the entirety of your book. I'm talking about irrelevant book endings. As editor Jeff Gerke says in The Art and Craft of Writing Christian Fiction, I can't tell you how many unpublished novels I've read in which the ending has absolutely nothing to do with the beginning. So how do you write distractingly irrelevant book endings? This one is super easy. Just write a plot that hooks a 90-degree turn somewhere in its second half. For example, Jane spends the first half of the book on a quest to find sentient life in the stars, but then switches focus in the second half to the custody battle over her kids. Edward spends the first half of the book trying to get the love of his life to forgive him, but then switches focus in the second half to bringing down the mafia. Laurie spends the first half of the book reconciling herself to her cancer diagnosis, but then switches focus in the second half to writing a scandalous expose on an aging movie star. Jake spends the first half of the book learning to skydive, but then switches focus in the second half to adopting a son. Eleanor spends the first half of the book learning to use her new superpower, but then switches focus in the second half to reconciling with her estranged father. Now, you may be quick to realize any of the above combos could work in the same book to create some really interesting layers and juxtapositions, but they only work if both of them are properly set up in the first act. A story is the sum total of its parts, but all its parts must work together to create a pleasingly cohesive and resonant sum. Anything that happens in the second half needs to be set up in the first. We might remedy the disasters in the previous section by reworking them just slightly. Jane's overall goal is to find sentient life in the stars, but a subplot focuses on her personal life and the custody battle over her kids, which might tie into the main plot via a motif of the family as a symbol of the universe. Edward's overall goal is to get the love of his life to forgive him, but to do that, he has to cut his ties with the mafia by bringing it down from the inside out. Laurie's main personal issue is her cancer diagnosis, but the plot might be about her last chance to write the biggest article of her career, a scandalous expose on an aging movie star. It turns out the movie star has a few things to teach her about living, dying, and coming to grips with her illness. Jake the adventurer starts out the book learning to skydive, but when he meets orphaned Hank early on, he quickly forms the relationship that will cause him to rethink his self-absorbed lifestyle and lead him to adopt Hank. Eleanor's early goal is learning to use her new superpower, but in order to truly claim personal empowerment, she will also have to resolve the subplot, featuring the ghost from her past, with her estranged father. Of course, you could also rewrite all of these more dramatically to maintain a more obvious cohesion between beginning and ending. For example, Jane spends the first half of the book on a quest to find sentient life in the stars, and in the second half, she goes to Mars. Edward spends the first half of the book trying to get the love of his life to forgive him, and in the second half, he kidnaps her to try to get some alone time to talk to her. Laurie spends the first half of the book reconciling herself to her cancer diagnosis, and in the second half she goes on a bucket list cross-country trip where she collects important pieces of wisdom from the people she encounters. Jake spends the first half of the book learning to skydive, and in the second half he falls, is paralyzed, and has to learn to jump out of planes without the use of his legs. Eleanor spends the first half of the book learning to use her new superpower, and in the second half, she heroically unites Disney and Warner Brothers. The possibilities are as endless as your imagination. The only rule is that the ending must be the direct result of the beginning. The problem of irrelevant book endings can result from a number of issues, including 1. The author didn't know the ending when she started writing, and her beginning failed to properly set up the ending. 2. The author didn't know the ending when he started, and he had to write his way through half a book of fluff to figure out the true plot. 3. The plot in the first half of the book ran out of steam around the midpoint, and the author had to come up with an additional plot line to finish out his word count. 4. The author planned a slam-bang ending, but found herself needing to kill time in the first half of the book since the setup didn't provide enough story events to fill out the plot before she arrived at the true conflict. 5. The author lacked a foundational understanding of story structure and failed to realize that the lack of continuity from beginning to end of the book is problematic. So, time to ask yourself some important questions. Do you know where you're headed with your story? If so, is the ending a logical reflection of the beginning? If not, how can you use the events featured in your story's beginning to set up a logical and resonant finale? These are tough questions, but their answers are what define every book. Find the right answers, and you'll never have to worry about the common writing mistake of irrelevant book endings. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.